In the late 1980s, the United States prison system faced a crisis, and it all came to a head in one particularly infamous location, the Attica Correctional Facility in New York. Attica was a maximum security prison known for its overcrowding, underfunded conditions, and a volatile environment. What happened at Attica serves as one of the most brutal and unsettling examples of how a prison can be overrun by its own inmates, where the system failed and the consequences were catastrophic. Attica was home to over 2,000 men at the time, despite being built for fewer than 1,300. Overcrowding was a persistent issue throughout the 1970s, and the inmates were frustrated with the lack of basic necessities such as proper medical care, adequate food, and even clean clothes. There was a glaring lack of rehabilitation programs, and the prison staff was often overworked, underpaid, and ill-equipped to handle the situation. Tensions had been simmering for years, and on September 9, 1971, those tensions reached a boiling point. A group of inmates, led by a man named Steve, took control of the prison during a riot. They seized a section of the facility and took 42 hostages, including guards and civilian workers. The prisoners' demands were simple, but they were also a reflection of their frustration with the system. They wanted better living conditions, better treatment, and a say in their rehabilitation. They were tired of being treated like animals. The authorities, including the state governor, Nelson Rockefeller, were immediately notified of the situation. Negotiations began, but tensions only escalated. The prisoners, although initially cooperative, grew increasingly concerned about the treatment of their fellow inmates and the state's unwillingness to make meaningful changes. The situation was tense, and the atmosphere within the prison grew darker with each passing hour. By September 13th, the situation had reached its breaking point. After days of negotiations, the state decided to take a more aggressive approach. A full-scale assault was ordered, and state troopers, along with prison guards, stormed the prison. They used tear gas, and the violence that followed was nothing short of brutal. Inmates and guards alike were injured or killed in the chaos, but the scale of the destruction was staggering. 43 people died during the retaking of Attica, including 10 hostages and 33 inmates. The aftermath of the Attica riot shocked the nation. The prison was left in ruins, and the state was forced to reckon with the reality of the violence and destruction. The public was left questioning how such a tragedy could have occurred and whether the system was capable of handling a crisis of this magnitude. The events at Attica would remain a dark chapter in the history of American prisons, and the lessons learned from that day continue to shape the way we view prison reform. While the Attica riot itself was over, its legacy lived on. The survivors of the riot, both inmates and guards, would carry the scars of that day with them for the rest of their lives. The families of the hostages who lost their lives had to live with the tragic loss, and the state of New York would never be the same again. It was a moment when a prison became a battlefield, and its own inhabitants were responsible for the violence that ensued. Even though Attica is no longer the same facility it was in the 1970s, the story of its overrun by inmates serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of the prison system. It is a stark illustration of how systemic issues, poor management, and a lack of proper resources can lead to disaster. The events at Attica are still studied by criminologists, historians, and reformers who seek to understand the complexities of the prison system and what went wrong during that fateful period. The story of the prison that was overrun by its own inmates is not unique to Attica. Throughout history, there have been numerous instances where prisoners have seized control of facilities, often in protest of the conditions in which they live. These events are a direct result of the systemic failures that plague many correctional institutions worldwide. Inmates, who often feel powerless and voiceless, resort to extreme measures to get attention, and these uprisings are a tragic consequence of ignored grievances. One of the key reasons that prisons become overrun by their own inmates is overcrowding. When prisons become too full, they begin to break down. The staff becomes overwhelmed, the resources become stretched thin, and the inmates begin to feel like they have no way out. In many cases, overcrowding leads to violence as tensions rise between inmates who are forced to compete for basic necessities like food and space. In the case of Attica, the overcrowding was one of the main catalysts for the riot. The conditions that prisoners live in are another factor that contributes to uprisings. Many prisons are poorly maintained with inadequate sanitation, broken equipment, and moldy, overcrowded cells. These conditions breed resentment and frustration among the inmates. When prisoners feel that their basic human needs are not being met, they become desperate, and this can lead to violent actions. At Attica, the inmates had been demanding better living conditions for years, but their voices had been ignored by the authorities, which led to the deadly uprising. The lack of adequate medical care in prisons is another serious issue that can lead to unrest. In many cases, inmates are denied proper medical treatment, and this can lead to untreated illnesses and injuries. When prisoners are left to suffer, they begin to question the system's commitment to their well-being. At Attica, many inmates were sick or injured, and they had no recourse to address their needs. This lack of care was another reason for the anger that fueled the riot. Another factor that contributed to the overrun of prisons is the lack of meaningful rehabilitation programs. Prisons often focus on punishment rather than rehabilitation, which leaves inmates feeling hopeless about their future. Without programs that help them learn new skills, get education, or even find ways to deal with their anger, inmates can become frustrated and lash out. The failure of the system to provide these essential services can lead to violence, as was evident in the Attica riot. The mistreatment of inmates by prison staff also plays a significant role in uprisings. In many cases, correctional officers use excessive force and mistreat prisoners, which creates an environment of fear and resentment. This mistreatment erodes any sense of trust between the staff and the inmates, and it makes it more likely that an uprising will occur. In the case of Attica, the way that inmates were treated by the guards played a significant role in the eruption of violence. The leadership within a prison can also influence whether or not it will be overrun by inmates. When prisons are poorly managed, inmates are often left with little hope of improving their circumstances. Leadership that fails to address the issues of overcrowding, poor conditions, and mistreatment creates a powder keg that is ready to explode. The lack of effective leadership at Attica contributed to the conditions that led to the uprising. In the absence of proper management, the inmates took matters into their own hands. The response of the authorities to uprisings is often one of the most critical factors in determining the outcome. In some cases, the authorities negotiate with the inmates to resolve the situation peacefully. However, in other cases, the authorities choose to use force, which can escalate the violence and lead to more deaths. The decision to storm Attica with force led to a disastrous outcome. The use of excessive force only made the situation worse, resulting in the deaths of both inmates and guards. Prison uprisings like the one at Attica are often seen as a failure of the justice system. When a prison becomes overrun by its own inmates, it is a clear sign that the system is broken. These events highlight the need for reform in the way that prisons are run, and they demonstrate the importance of addressing the root causes of inmate unrest. The Attica riot showed that if the system continues to ignore the needs of prisoners, the consequences can be catastrophic. Despite the violence and destruction that occurred at Attica, some positive changes did come out of the tragedy. In the aftermath of the riot, there was increased attention on the conditions inside prisons, and there were efforts to improve the way that inmates were treated. There was a push for better conditions, more educational programs, and greater oversight of prison staff. While these changes were not immediate, they laid the groundwork for future reforms in the prison system. The Attica riot served as a warning to other prisons across the country. It showed that when inmates are pushed to their breaking point, they will take drastic measures to make their voices heard. The prison system had to learn from the mistakes of the past in order to avoid similar uprisings in the future. The events at Attica were a wake-up call for the entire system, and they sparked debates about prison reform that continue to this day. Many other prisons have experienced similar uprisings in the years following Attica. These riots, like the one at Attica, are often the result of systemic failures that go unaddressed for too long. As long as prisons continue to be overcrowded, underfunded, and poorly managed, they will remain prone to violent outbursts. The need for reform in the prison system is as urgent as ever, and the lessons of Attica should never be forgotten. Over the years, there have been numerous instances of prison uprisings in places like California, Arizona, and Texas. These riots have often been triggered by similar factors: overcrowding, inadequate resources, mistreatment by staff, and a lack of rehabilitation programs. Each of these uprisings serves as a reminder that when the system fails, the consequences can be deadly. The legacy of Attica lives on in the way that prisons are run today. While there have been some improvements in the treatment of inmates, there is still much work to be done. Prisons continue to struggle with overcrowding, poor conditions, and a lack of effective rehabilitation programs. If the lessons of Attica are not learned, the cycle of violence and unrest will continue. The Attica riot also changed the way that law enforcement views inmates. Prior to the riot, prisoners were often seen as little more than criminals to be punished. However, the violence that erupted at Attica forced many to reevaluate their approach to incarceration. It became clear that treating inmates like animals would only lead to more violence. Prison reform became a priority for many lawmakers, and the hope was that future generations of prisoners would not face the same conditions that led to the Attica disaster. The role of prison guards in the Attica riot was also significant. Many guards were taken hostage by the inmates, and some were killed during the assault. The experience left lasting trauma on both the guards and the inmates. The prison system had to recognize that both sides, staff and inmates, needed to be protected from harm. The events at Attica changed the way that corrections officers were trained and how they interacted with prisoners. The aftermath of Attica raised significant questions about the role of the state in handling uprisings. The decision to use force rather than engage in peaceful negotiations led to a loss of life that could have been avoided. The state had failed to address the root causes of the unrest, and the consequences were devastating. This failure would haunt the New York state government for years to come. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Attica riot was the treatment of the prisoners after the fact. Many of the survivors were tortured and mistreated by law enforcement in the aftermath of the riot. This abuse further fueled the resentment that led to the uprising in the first place. The mistreatment of prisoners was a reminder that the prison system had a long way to go before it could truly be called fair or just. Prison reform has been an ongoing struggle since the events at Attica. While there have been some improvements in the way that prisoners are treated, many of the same problems persist. Overcrowding remains a serious issue, and many prisons are still underfunded and understaffed. The lessons of Attica must continue to inform efforts to create a more just and humane prison system. The impact of the Attica riot extended beyond the prison walls. The event sparked a national conversation about the state of the prison system and the treatment of inmates. It brought attention to the issues of overcrowding, poor conditions, and a lack of rehabilitation programs. In the years that followed, activists and lawmakers worked to push for reforms that would address the systemic problems that led to the riot. The prison system in America continues to face significant challenges. The issues of overcrowding, inadequate resources, and mistreatment of prisoners have not been fully addressed. While there have been some reforms, the reality is that many prisoners continue to live in conditions that are far from humane. The events at Attica remain a stark reminder of the dangers of neglecting the needs of inmates. Many of the survivors of the Attica riot have spent their lives advocating for prison reform. These individuals know firsthand the impact of the brutal treatment that prisoners often face, and they have dedicated themselves to ensuring that future generations of inmates do not experience the same horrors. Their efforts have helped to raise awareness about the issues facing the prison system and have led to important changes in the way that prisons are run. The Attica riot also had a significant impact on the public perception of prisons. Prior to the riot, many Americans were unaware of the conditions inside correctional facilities. However, the violence at Attica brought the realities of the prison system into the spotlight. The public was forced to confront the fact that prisons were often dangerous, overcrowded, and ill-equipped to handle the needs of inmates. This new awareness helped to fuel the calls for prison reform. One of the main lessons of Attica is that when prisoners are treated unfairly or inhumanely, they will eventually rebel. This is not a justification for violence, but a reminder that the prison system must be held accountable for the conditions in which inmates are kept. The events at Attica showed that neglecting the needs of prisoners only leads to more violence and suffering. The Attica riot is a pivotal moment in the history of the American prison system. It marked the first time that such an event of this magnitude had occurred in the United States, and it forced the country to grapple with the realities of its prison system. While much has been learned since that day, the challenges that led to the riot are still very much present in today's prisons. Since the Attica riot, there have been other uprisings across the country. These riots have been sparked by many of the same issues that led to the events at Attica: overcrowding, inadequate resources, and mistreatment by prison staff. Each of these uprisings serves as a reminder that the prison system is still struggling to address the root causes of inmate unrest. The events at Attica have been a subject of intense study by criminologists, historians, and legal scholars. The lessons learned from the riot continue to shape the way that prisons are run today. While there have been some positive changes, there is still much work to be done to create a fair and just prison system. One of the main issues that continues to plague the American prison system is the treatment of mentally ill prisoners. Many inmates who suffer from mental illnesses are placed in solitary confinement, which only exacerbates their conditions. This inhumane treatment can lead to violent outbursts as prisoners become increasingly frustrated and desperate for help. The treatment of mentally ill inmates was a significant issue at Attica, and it continues to be a problem in prisons today. Another lesson learned from Attica is the importance of providing prisoners with access to education and rehabilitation programs. Without these programs, prisoners are left with little hope for a better future, and this lack of opportunity can lead to violent outbursts. Providing inmates with the tools they need to succeed once they are released is one of the most effective ways to prevent future uprisings and ensure that prisoners can reintegrate into society. The Attica riot also highlighted the need for better oversight and accountability in the prison system. Without proper oversight, prison staff are able to abuse their power and mistreat inmates without fear of punishment. In the case of Attica, the abuse and mistreatment of prisoners by guards contributed to the anger that led to the riot. Holding prison staff accountable for their actions is essential to preventing future uprisings. In the years following the Attica riot, prison reform advocates pushed for changes to the way that prisons were run. These reforms included measures to reduce overcrowding, improve conditions, and provide better rehabilitation programs for inmates. While some progress has been made, many of the same problems that led to the Attica riot still persist in the prison system. The Attica riot also brought attention to the issue of prison privatization. As more prisons were sold to private companies, the focus shifted from rehabilitation to profit. This created an environment in which prisons were more interested in cutting costs than providing prisoners with the resources they needed. This shift in priorities has contributed to the overcrowding and poor conditions that continue to plague the system. Despite the challenges, there have been some positive changes in the prison system since Attica. Prison reform advocates have worked tirelessly to address the issues that led to the riot, and while progress has been slow, there have been some successes. Today, there is more awareness of the need for reform, and the public is more attuned to the issues facing the prison system. The events of Attica are still felt in the prison system today. The riot was a turning point in the history of American prisons, and its impact is still felt in the ongoing struggle for reform. The lessons learned from the riot continue to shape the way that we view and treat prisoners. The issue of prison reform is far from resolved. There are still many challenges to overcome, including overcrowding, inadequate resources, and the mistreatment of prisoners. However, the events of Attica serve as a reminder that change is possible and that reform efforts can make a difference. The Attica riot was a tragic event, but it also led to important conversations about the state of the prison system. The lessons learned from that day have influenced policy decisions and have helped to shape the future of the prison system in the United States. As we continue to grapple with the issues facing the prison system, it's important to remember the events of Attica. It serves as a powerful reminder that when the system fails, the consequences can be devastating. By addressing the root causes of inmate unrest, we can work to prevent future tragedies. One of the key takeaways from the Attica riot is the need for reform that focuses on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Inmates who were given the opportunity to improve themselves and learn new skills are less likely to engage in violent behavior. A focus on rehabilitation can help break the cycle of violence that is so prevalent in many correctional facilities. Ultimately, the story of Attica is a cautionary tale. It shows what can happen when the prison system fails to meet the needs of its inhabitants. By addressing the issues that led to the riot and continuing to push for meaningful reform, we can prevent future uprisings and create a more just system for all. The story of Attica reminds us that prisons are not just institutions for punishment but also places where people can change. If we want to break the cycle of violence and incarceration, we must commit to creating a prison system that is focused on rehabilitation, fairness, and justice.